A boy in the shadows. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked pavement, a damp chill clinging to the crumbling walls of East Hollow. The distant hum of the city felt like a different world compared to the desolation of these streets, where streetlights flickered weakly, barely managing to keep the darkness at bay. Standing beneath the weak glow of one of these lights was a boy, no older than 13, wrapped in a tattered hoodie 2 sizes too big. His sneakers were scuffed beyond recognition, and his jeans were frayed at the hems. He stood motionless, his posture rigid, as if bracing himself for something unseen. His name was Elijah Tate, and he had long since learned that the world was a cruel, unkind place. Officer Ben Whittaker had been patrolling East Hollow for over a decade, and he had seen his fair share of lost souls wandering these streets. But something about this boy unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way Elijah's dark eyes darted toward the shadows between buildings, as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge at any moment. Maybe it was the way he stood, not like a child waiting for help, but like someone who already knew help would never come. Whittaker pulled his cruiser up alongside the curb, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. He wasn't sure why, but the longer he looked at the boy, the heavier the air seemed to grow. With a quiet sigh, he stepped out of the car. The crunch of his boots against the pavement broke the silence, but Elijah didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring into the empty space beyond the street. "You all right, kid?" Whittaker asked, keeping his voice even. Elijah finally turned his head, his gaze locking onto the officers with an intensity that made Whittaker's stomach twist. The boy's eyes were dark, unreadable. There was no fear in them, no relief, no expectation of kindness, just acceptance. "I'm fine," Elijah said, but there was something hollow about the words. Whittaker studied him for a moment. "What's your name?" "Elijah." "Where do you live?" Elijah hesitated. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, and his lips parted as if he was about to say something. But then he closed them again. "Nowhere," he finally muttered. Whittaker sighed internally. Another runaway. Another kid slipping through the cracks. He had seen too many just like him, and it never got easier. "All right," the officer said, shifting his stance. "Listen, it's not safe to be out here alone, especially this late. Why don't we get you somewhere warm?" Elijah didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced past Whittaker, toward the empty alleyway behind him. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, tensed. Then, he did something Whittaker didn't expect. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and leaned in slightly. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said 2 words. Whittaker's breath hitched in his throat. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs, his instincts kicking into overdrive before his mind could even register what had just happened. Without hesitation, his hand flew to the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch, I need backup at my location. Now." Elijah took a slow step back, his face unreadable. Whittaker's pulse pounded in his ears as he scanned the area, suddenly hyper-aware of the shadows creeping along the alley's edge, of the way the streetlights seemed dimmer than before. The words the boy had whispered echoed in his head, chilling him to his core. "They're coming." The weight of silence. Whittaker was a veteran cop. He had seen gang violence, drug deals gone bad, robberies turned fatal, but nothing had ever made him react like this, because there was something in Elijah's voice, something in those 2 words, that sent an undeniable message. This wasn't a warning. It was a statement. A fact. The radio on his shoulder crackled. "Unit 17, confirm nature of backup request." Whittaker swallowed, his grip tightening around his belt. He hesitated before responding. "Possible. Situation unfolding. Stand by." It was a vague answer, but how was he supposed to explain what just happened? He wasn't even sure himself. He turned back to Elijah. The boy hadn't moved. "Elijah," Whittaker said, keeping his voice steady. "Who's coming?" Elijah didn't blink, "The ones who took my brother." A prickle of unease crawled up Whittaker's spine. He had been expecting an answer like some gang or bad people. But this felt different. He glanced at the alley again. A strange pressure had settled in the air, thick and heavy, like the moment before a storm. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. Elijah shifted his gaze downward. His fingers twitched again. "You won't believe me. Try me." The boy hesitated. Then, after a long silence, he finally spoke. "They don't have faces," he murmured. "Just shadows. And they whisper before they take you." Whittaker's stomach tightened. He wasn't sure what disturbed him more, the words themselves, or the way Elijah said them. Like he had seen them. Like he knew what was coming. A strange sound drifted through the air. Faint, almost imperceptible. A whisper. Whittaker's head snapped toward the alley. His hand instinctively moved to his holster. "Elijah," he said carefully, his voice just above a whisper. "Is there someone following you?" Elijah didn't answer, but his eyes flicked toward the darkness again. And that was answer enough. Whittaker exhaled sharply. "All right, get in the car." The boy hesitated, then climbed into the cruiser without argument. That, more than anything, told Whittaker just how serious this was. As soon as the door shut, Whittaker turned his full attention to the alley. His fingers hovered near his gun as he took a slow step forward. The whispering sound was gone. But the air was wrong. Too still. Too quiet. The back of his neck prickled with something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear. Not exactly. Something worse. The undeniable sense that he was being watched. He exhaled sharply, turning back toward the car. Something moved in the corner of his vision. A shape, blacker than the night itself. Whittaker spun, gun raised, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, but this time it wasn't the dispatcher. It was a voice. Low, distant, whispering. Whittaker didn't understand the words, but Elijah did, and the look on his face was pure terror. The shadows that watch. The air inside the patrol car was thick with silence. The city noise, the distant sirens, the occasional shout from the streets, none of it seemed to reach inside. It was as if they had stepped into a space between moments where the world outside had paused. Elijah sat rigidly in the passenger seat, his small fingers gripping the edge of his hoodie. His knuckles were white. He kept his head turned toward the alley, his wide eyes scanning the darkness. Officer Ben Whittaker kept his hands on the wheel, his jaw tight. He had called for backup. Standard procedure. But something about this didn't feel standard at all. He had faced armed criminals, raging fires, and desperate people on the verge of destruction. But none of those had ever made his instincts scream at him the way this did. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. His radio crackled again, but it wasn't dispatch. It was that voice. A whisper. Low, curling around the edges of sound, slithering into the spaces between his thoughts. Ben's fingers twitched toward the volume dial, but before he could lower it, Elijah suddenly turned to him. "Don't," the boy whispered. Ben's hand froze midair. He looked at the kid, his stomach twisting. Elijah wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the radio. Or, more specifically, at the small speaker where the voice had come through. "What is it?" Ben asked, keeping his own voice low. Elijah swallowed hard, his lips trembling. "It means they're close." A shiver ran down Ben's spine. He had dealt with people on bad drugs before, people who talked about things watching them, hearing voices in the shadows. But Elijah didn't look like someone caught in a delusion. He looked like someone waiting for the inevitable. Ben flicked his eyes toward the rearview mirror. The alley was still empty. The dim streetlights cast long, stretching shadows, but there was nothing unusual. At least, not that he could see. "Who's close?" Ben asked carefully. Elijah turned his head slightly, staring at Ben like he was debating whether or not to say it. Finally, he spoke. "They don't have names." Ben frowned. "Who are they?" Elijah's fingers twitched again. His breath hitched. "You wouldn't believe me." Ben clenched his jaw. He had heard those words before. "You wouldn't believe me, officer. But I swear I saw it." Usually, it came from people in deep distress. People who had convinced themselves of things that weren't real. But Elijah wasn't just afraid. He was resigned, like he had already made peace with whatever was coming. Ben exhaled through his nose, gripping the steering wheel. He needed to do this the right way. Calmly. Logically. "Elijah, listen to me," he said, keeping his voice firm but steady. "I don't know what's going on, but I can help you. If someone's after you, if someone took your brother, then we need to call this in. The more I know, the better I can protect you." Elijah blinked slowly. "You can't protect me." The way he said it made something cold settle in Ben's gut. "Elijah." The radio crackled again. The whispering returned. This time, Ben felt it. Not just heard it. Felt it. It was like the sound slid under his skin, curling around his ribs, slithering along his spine. The words were unintelligible, but their effect was undeniable. A pressure built in the air, thick and suffocating. The hairs on the back of Ben's neck stood up. And then, outside the car, the streetlights flickered. Not a normal flicker, like old bulbs struggling against the night. This was deliberate. A pulse. On. Off. On. Off. As if something was testing them. Elijah sucked in a sharp breath. His hands clenched into fists. "They know we're here," he whispered. Ben's heart pounded against his ribs. He grabbed the radio. "All units, this is Officer Whittaker, requesting immediate assistance at my location." Possible. He hesitated. What was he supposed to say? Unknown threat. Silence. No response. Ben frowned and repeated, "Dispatch, do you copy?" More silence. Then, "Static." Ben flinched as a sharp burst of static exploded through the speaker. The whispering returned, only this time. It was louder, more insistent. And then, a new voice. Not a whisper. A single word. Drawn out. Mocking. "Officer." Ben's breath hitched. It hadn't come from the radio. It had come from outside the car. Slowly, painfully, he turned his head. Something stood just beyond the reach of the streetlight. At first, it looked like a figure. A person. But then, the shadows shifted. The shape was there, but not. Darker than the night itself, shifting and warping like liquid smoke. It had no eyes, no face, only an emptiness that somehow felt aware. Watching. Waiting. A primal instinct screamed in Ben's head. Run. But he was frozen. Trapped in place by something he couldn't understand. And then the voice came again. Not from the figure. Not from the radio. From inside his head. Let him go. Ben's blood turned to ice. He sucked in a shaky breath, his hand moving to his gun. His training told him to aim, to warn, to fire if necessary. But something deeper, something older, told him that bullets wouldn't matter. "Elijah," he whispered. "What the hell is that?" Elijah was trembling now. His lips barely moved. "They took my brother," he whispered. "And now they want me." The figure took a single step forward. The streetlight above them shattered. Darkness swallowed the street. And then, the whispers surged, louder, crawling inside Ben's skull, twisting through his thoughts, pressing against his mind like invisible fingers searching for a way in. His vision blurred. His pulse roared in his ears. For the first time in years, he felt truly helpless. And then, a scream. Not from him. Not from Elijah. From the radio. High-pitched, distorted. And then, just as suddenly, silence. Ben gasped, jerking back to reality. He fumbled for the ignition, slamming his foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement as the car lurched forward. Elijah curled into himself in the seat, whispering something under his breath, over and over again. Ben barely heard it over his own pounding heartbeat, but when he did, it made his blood run cold. You can't run from the shadows. Nowhere is safe. The patrol car's engine roared as Officer Ben Whittaker sped down the empty street, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breath was uneven, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The shattered streetlight, the figure darker than the night itself, the voice that had slithered into his thoughts. None of it made sense. None of it was possible. Yet it had happened. Beside him, Elijah Tate sat curled into himself, knees drawn to his chest. His lips moved silently, whispering the same phrase over and over. You can't run from the shadows. Ben risked a glance at the boy. He was shaking. His small fingers dug into the fabric of his hoodie like he was trying to hold himself together. Elijah, Ben said, his voice hoarse. No response. Ben exhaled through his nose, trying to steady himself. Kid, talk to me. What the hell was that back there? Elijah finally turned his head, his dark eyes wide and unfocused. You saw it, didn't you? Ben tightened his grip on the wheel. Yeah, he had seen it, but he wasn't ready to admit that. Not yet. What do you mean? Ben asked instead. Elijah blinked slowly, as if deciding whether or not to answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, It's been following me since the night my brother disappeared. A chill ran down Ben's spine. Start from the beginning, he said. Elijah's fingers twitched. He exhaled shakily. My brother, Jordan, his voice itched. He swallowed hard, like the words themselves hurt. He was 17, always took care of me, ever since our parents died. Ben stayed quiet, letting the boy talk. One night, we were walking home from the corner store, Elijah continued. It was late. Too late. But we didn't have much food at home, and Jordan wanted to get me something to eat. His gaze dropped to his lap. We cut through an alley to get back faster. We'd done it before. But that night, he trailed off, his breath coming faster. Ben waited. What happened, Elijah? The boy licked his lips, eyes flickering toward the window. We heard whispering. Ben's stomach tightened. At first, we thought it was just some people talking, but the closer we got, the weirder it sounded. Like it wasn't coming from one voice. It was a bunch of voices, layered, talking at the same time. Ben clenched his jaw. Elijah's hands trembled. Jordan told me to stay close, but then the shadows started moving. Ben exhaled sharply. Moving. Elijah nodded, his eyes distant, like smoke, like something was inside them, watching us, waiting. Ben swallowed. Then what? Elijah's breath hitched. Jordan grabbed my hand and told me to run. A pause. Then. But I didn't. Ben frowned. Why not? Elijah's fingers dug into his hoodie again. Because he couldn't. The patrol car hit a red light. Ben slowed to a stop, turning to fully face the boy. What do you mean? Elijah's lips quivered. His voice was barely a breath. They grabbed him. A cold weight settled in Ben's chest. Who? Elijah shook his head, his breath uneven. Not who. What? Ben's pulse thudded in his ears. I saw them. Elijah continued. They weren't people. They were shadows, darker than anything I've ever seen. They wrapped around him like smoke, like they were alive. He screamed. His voice cracked. I tried to help him. I tried to pull him free. But he was already. Elijah clenched his jaw. Then he was gone. Ben's stomach twisted. Gone. Elijah's fingers dug deeper into his hoodie, like he was never there. 1 second, I was holding onto his wrist, and the next, he swallowed. There was nothing. The patrol car was dead silent. Ben stared at the boy, his brain fighting against the story he was hearing. It sounded impossible. It was impossible. But after what he had seen tonight, he wasn't so sure anymore. His radio crackled again, snapping him back to reality. Unit 17. Officer Whittaker, do you copy? Ben grabbed the radio. This is Whittaker. This is dispatch. You called for backup earlier. What's your status? Ben hesitated. He had no idea how to explain what had happened. Situation's still developing, he finally said. Need officers to meet me at. A whisper. Not over the radio. From the backseat. Ben's heart nearly stopped. His grip tightened around the wheel as he turned his head slowly. The backseat was empty. But the whispering was still there. Soft, taunting. Ben's blood ran cold. He spun forward again, shifting the car into drive. Elijah, he said, keeping his voice low. Do they follow you everywhere? Elijah didn't answer right away. He was staring at the back seat now, his breath coming in short gasps. Finally, he whispered, They never leave. A deep, gut-wrenching dread settled into Ben's bones. He pressed harder on the gas. The motel. 20 minutes later, they arrived at a rundown motel on the edge of town. Ben didn't know why he chose it. He just knew they needed to get somewhere safe, if that was even possible. The neon sign flickered erratically as they pulled into the lot. The place looked abandoned, but there were a few cars in the lot. Ben cut the engine. Elijah, he said, we're staying here for the night, just until I can figure out what's going on. The boy nodded slowly, but he didn't move. Ben frowned. Kid. Elijah's lips parted. His voice was barely a whisper. They're already here. Ben's stomach twisted. Before he could respond, the motel's neon sign flickered violently. Then it went out completely. Total darkness swallowed the parking lot. And then, the whispering returned. Louder. Closer. Surrounding them. Ben's breath hitched. His hand flew to his gun as he scanned the shadows, but there was nothing to aim at. No figures, no shapes, just darkness. And then, right next to his ear, a whisper. Soft, amused. You shouldn't have brought him here. Ben spun. Nothing. Elijah, he hissed. Get inside. Now. The boy bolted from the car, sprinting toward the motel door. Ben followed, his pulse slamming against his ribs. As they reached the entrance, the whispering grew deafening. And then, Elijah screamed. Ben turned just in time to see a shadow gripping the boy's ankle. Elijah clawed at the ground, panic flooding his face. Help me. Ben didn't think. He lunged. His fingers closed around Elijah's wrist. He pulled. A guttural hiss erupted from the darkness, like air escaping from 1,000 throats. The grip on Elijah's ankle loosened, and Ben yanked him free. They stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The motel lights flickered wildly. Outside, the whispering surged. And then, all at once, silence. Ben's chest heaved. He turned to Elijah. The boy looked up at him, his face pale. His voice was a trembling whisper. They're getting stronger. No escape. The motel room was suffocatingly small, a single dim light flickering above the worn-out bed. The walls were a sickly yellow, stained with years of cigarette smoke, and the air smelled of dust and stale coffee. Elijah sat on the edge of the bed, his legs curled beneath him, his fingers gripping the hem of his hoodie. His breathing was uneven, still recovering from the encounter outside. Ben Whittaker stood by the door, his back pressed against it, one hand resting on his holstered weapon. His heart was still hammering in his chest. The whispering had stopped. For now. But he could feel it, lingering just beyond the door. Watching. Waiting. He exhaled slowly and looked at the kid. All right, he said, his voice low but steady. Start talking. I need everything. No more half-truths. No more vague warnings. I need to know exactly what's after you." Elijah hesitated. His eyes flickered to the window, where the neon motel sign remained dark, its buzzing light now completely lifeless. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "I told you about my brother," he whispered. Ben nodded. Elijah took a shaky breath. "But I didn't tell you what happened after he disappeared." A chill ran down Ben's spine. Elijah's voice dropped even lower. "I stayed in that alley for hours after he was taken. I thought maybe he'd come back. That maybe I was imagining things." His fingers clenched the fabric of his hoodie tighter. But then the whispers started. Ben felt something cold coil in his stomach. "I couldn't tell where they were coming from," Elijah continued. "They were everywhere. Around me. Inside my head. They kept saying the same thing over and over." Ben swallowed. "What did they say?" Elijah's lips trembled. "He's ours now." A shiver ran down Ben's spine. Elijah looked up, his dark eyes filled with something between sorrow and terror. "And then they said my name." Ben's fingers twitched over his holster. "They've been following me ever since," Elijah whispered. "Everywhere I go, they get stronger, closer, and every time I hear Jordan's voice." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Like he's still trapped in there. Like he's begging for help." Ben exhaled sharply. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. None of this made sense, but after what he had witnessed, after what had grabbed Elijah outside, he couldn't deny it anymore. This was real. Something was hunting this kid, and it wasn't human. Ben's radio crackled, making them both jump. "Unit 17, Officer Whittaker, do you copy?" Ben snatched it from his belt. "This is Whittaker." A pause. Then, "Sir, we've been trying to reach you for over 20 minutes." Ben frowned. "I called for backup. What's the holdup?" A longer pause this time. Then, the dispatcher's voice returned, quieter. "Sir, we already sent a unit to your location." Ben's stomach twisted. "What?" "About 15 minutes ago," the dispatcher said. "They reported seeing your vehicle at the motel, but they couldn't find you." A cold shudder ran through him. "That's impossible," he muttered. "We've been here the whole time." Elijah stiffened. The radio crackled again. "Sir, the officers said they saw something strange. Before their radios cut out, they reported shadow-like figures moving around the building. Then we lost contact." The room suddenly felt much, much smaller. Ben inhaled sharply, turning to Elijah. "They're here," the boy whispered. The light above them flickered. And then, a soft, sickening whisper slithered through the room. "Let us in." Ben froze. The voice wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the walls. Nowhere to run. The whispering grew louder, swirling around them, filling the motel room like a cold fog. The light overhead buzzed violently before. "P up." Darkness. Elijah gasped. Ben cursed under his breath, his pulse hammering as he drew his gun. The room was pitch black now, the only faint light coming from the window. Then something moved outside. A shadow. Not a person. Something wrong. Ben's grip on his gun tightened. He took a step toward the door, but Elijah's hand shot out, gripping his wrist. "Don't," the boy whispered. "They want you to open it." Ben hesitated. His instincts told him to run, to get Elijah out of here. But a deep primal part of him, the part that had seen too much tonight, knew Elijah was right. If he opened that door, they wouldn't make it out. He licked his lips, his mind racing. Is there another way out? Elijah nodded toward the bathroom. "There's a window." Ben didn't hesitate. He grabbed the boy's wrist and pulled him toward the bathroom, moving quickly but cautiously. The whispering grew angrier, the voices overlapping, pressing against them like an unseen force. Ben pushed open the bathroom door and froze. The mirror was wrong. Instead of their reflection, It showed something else. A dark alley. A boy screaming. Shadows pulling him away. And then, Jordan. He stood in the reflection, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Elijah gasped. Jordan? The whispering surged. Then, Jordan's mouth opened wider. Too wide. And from his throat, a whisper slithered into the room. Help me. Elijah lunged. Ben barely caught him in time. No. The second Elijah's fingers touched the mirror, the entire room shuddered. The walls groaned. The whispering turned into a scream. Ben yanked Elijah back as black tendrils erupted from the mirror, lashing out like living smoke. The glass shattered, sending shards flying as the darkness surged forward. Ben fired 3 shots into the mirror. Boom, boom, boom. The tendrils reeled back, hissing, before the mirror collapsed into 1,000 tiny pieces. The whispering stopped. Ben's chest heaved. Elijah was clutching his arm, his entire body trembling. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from outside the room, a knock. Soft, gentle. Ben's blood turned ice cold. They weren't done yet. The door between worlds. The knock came again. Soft, gentle, persistent. Ben Whittaker's fingers tightened around his gun, his knuckles white. Elijah clung to his arm, his breath shallow and rapid. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The whispering had stopped. The shadows had receded. But something about that knock was even more terrifying than the voices in the walls, because it didn't belong. The silence in the motel room was suffocating. The shattered mirror lay in pieces on the bathroom floor, the air thick with a strange metallic scent. Then, a voice. Elijah. The boy stiffened. Ben's grip on his gun tightened. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. Elijah. The voice whispered again, right outside the door. Ben's pulse hammered. It was Jordan's voice. The lost brother. The one swallowed by the darkness. The one who was supposed to be gone. Elijah. The voice repeated. Please, open the door. The boy shook his head violently. No, Elijah whispered. No, no, no. That's not him. His fingers dug into Ben's jacket. That's not my brother. Ben swallowed hard. He had been a cop for a long time. He had seen death, violence, things that most people only witnessed in nightmares. But this was something else, something he couldn't fight with a badge and a gun. The knocking came again, firmer this time. Elijah, the voice pleaded. It's cold out here. Let me in. The air in the room grew colder. Ben could see his own breath. He took a step back, positioning himself between the boy and the door. Elijah, he murmured, keeping his voice steady. What happens if we open that door? The boy swallowed hard, his eyes brimming with tears. They take us, he whispered. Ben's stomach twisted. Who? Elijah shuddered. I don't know what they are, he admitted. They aren't people. They wear faces, faces of the dead. They copy voices. His fingers trembled. But they aren't real. Ben exhaled slowly. That wasn't Jordan outside the door. It was something else. Something wearing his skin. The dead shouldn't knock. Ben took another step back. The gun felt useless in his hands. Elijah, the voice called again. Please, I don't have much time. The boy covered his ears. No, he whimpered. You're not him. Jordan is gone. The voice changed. The pleading tone melted away, replaced by something wrong. The voice deepened, turning distorted. He is gone, but you can bring him back. Ben's blood ran cold. The boy froze. Elijah's voice cracked. What do you mean? The thing outside the door laughed softly. A whisper crawled under the door like a snake. Open the door, Elijah, and I will show you. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing down on Ben's chest, like an unseen weight. His instincts screamed at him. "Don't listen to it," he ordered. "Whatever's out there, it's lying." Elijah's lips trembled, but there was something in his eyes. Something dangerous. Hope. A choice in the darkness. Elijah took a slow step toward the door. Ben grabbed his arm. "Kid," he said, voice urgent, "think about this. If your brother was really out there, do you think he'd want you to open that door?" Elijah hesitated. His fingers twitched. The whispering grew louder. "Elijah," the voice crooned, "I miss you. I need you." The boy bit his lip. His entire body trembled. Tears welled in his eyes. "Jordan." Ben's grip tightened. "No," he said firmly. "Whatever's out there, it's not your brother. And you know it." Elijah's breath came in shaky gasps. He looked at the door, then back at Ben. Then he shook his head. Tears spilled down his cheeks. "No," he whispered. The whispering stopped. Then the door handle rattled violently. Ben raised his gun. "Elijah," the voice outside said again. But this time, it wasn't human anymore. It was deep, echoing, wrong. The door shuddered as something slammed against it from the other side. Ben whirled. "We need to move. Now." Elijah nodded, panic rising in his throat. Ben grabbed the boy's wrist and raced toward the bathroom window. The moment they reached it, the door exploded. A gust of freezing darkness flooded the room, sending loose papers and glass shards spiraling into the air. Ben and Elijah dived through the window. The road to the unknown. They hit the ground hard, rolling onto the damp pavement. Ben groaned, pain shooting through his shoulder, but there was no time to stop. He grabbed Elijah and yanked him to his feet. "Run." They sprinted across the parking lot, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The neon motel sign flickered wildly, casting long, twisting shadows across the pavement. Then Ben made the mistake of looking back. The motel door was wide open, and standing in the doorway was a tall, blackened figure. Its body was shifting, flickering like smoke caught in a breeze. It had no face, just a hollow void where its features should have been. But its arms were long, unnaturally so. Its fingers curled, stretching toward them. It took a single step forward, and suddenly, every light in the parking lot went out. Ben's heart slammed against his ribs. He grabbed Elijah and kept running. The highway was up ahead. If they could just. A high-pitched shriek cut through the night. Ben's vision blurred. His knees buckled. The sound was everywhere, vibrating inside his skull, crawling under his skin. Elijah screamed. Ben gritted his teeth and pushed forward. They were so close. The headlights of a passing 18-wheeler appeared in the distance, its horn blaring as it thundered down the road. Ben saw his chance. With one final burst of energy, he pulled Elijah toward the pavement and into the path of the oncoming truck. The headlights swallowed them whole. The final threshold. The roar of the 18-wheeler thundered through the night. Its headlights sliced through the darkness, bathing the road in blinding white light. Ben Whittaker braced himself, every muscle in his body tightening as he pulled Elijah into the truck's path. And then, impact. But not the kind he expected. The light engulfed them, but instead of feeling the crushing force of steel and rubber, Ben felt something else. A sudden shift in the air, a bone-deep coldness crawling over his skin. And then, silence. Absolute silence. The world between. Ben's breath came out in a gasp. The highway was gone. The truck, the headlights, the sound of the roaring engine, all vanished. Instead, he and Elijah stood in a vast, endless expanse of black mist. The ground beneath their feet wasn't solid. It was like walking on air, weightless yet firm enough to hold them. Ben's fingers twitched around his gun, but something told him it was useless here. "Elijah," he murmured, his voice swallowed by the abyss around them. The boy stood frozen beside him, his wide, terrified eyes scanning their surroundings. "This is it," Elijah whispered. "This is where they took him." Ben's stomach twisted. Jordan. The lost brother. The reason they were running. "Where are we?" Ben asked, his voice low. Elijah swallowed hard. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think this is where the dead go and they don't belong anywhere else." The air shifted. Ben felt it before he saw it. A presence. Something was here with them. He turned sharply, scanning the void. At first, he saw nothing, just the endless black mist stretching into eternity. But then, a shape began to form. A shadow. No, not a shadow. A person. The ghost of a brother. Elijah. The whisper was gentle, familiar. Elijah gasped. "Jordan." Ben's grip on the boy's arm tightened, holding him back. "Wait." The figure stepped forward, emerging from the mist. It was him. Jordan. Or at least, something that looked like Jordan. His face was the same deep brown eyes, the same dimple in his left cheek. His clothes were the same as the day he disappeared, a red hoodie and ripped jeans. But something was wrong. His body flickered, like static on a broken television. And his eyes. They weren't normal. They were black. Endless. Empty. "Elijah," Jordan whispered again. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Elijah shook his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I tried. I didn't know how." Jordan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's okay," he said softly. "You can still save me." Ben's instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. This wasn't Jordan. Not anymore. The final choice. Ben pulled Elijah behind him. "I don't know what you are," he said, voice steady, "but you're not his brother." Jordan tilted his head, the flickering growing worse. "I am," he said. "I was, and I can be again. But Elijah has to let me in." Elijah froze. "What does that mean?" he whispered. Jordan's voice was gentle. "You have to take my place." Elijah's breath hitched. Ben's heart dropped. "No," he said, "that's not happening." Jordan's eyes snapped to him, and for the first time, his smile vanished. The warmth was gone. The darkness beneath his skin pulsed, growing stronger. "This isn't your fight, Officer Whitaker," he said, his voice suddenly deep, inhuman. It never was. Ben raised his gun. Jordan laughed. "Do you really think that works here?" The gun vanished from Ben's hands. A wave of cold slammed into him, knocking him to his knees. "Elijah," Jordan whispered, "let me in. Let me be free again." The boy trembled. Tears streamed down his face. Ben forced himself to move, even as his limbs fought against him. He had seen this look before. This was what it looked like when someone wanted to believe a lie. "Elijah," Ben rasped, his voice weak. "Don't. This isn't your brother." Elijah's hand shook. "But what if it is?" he whispered. Jordan smiled again. "That's my boy." He reached out, and Elijah moved to take his hand. The whisper that changed everything. Ben acted on instinct. He lunged forward, grabbing Elijah's wrist just as their hands touched. And then, he whispered two words that changed everything. "Elijah, remember." Jordan's smile froze. The darkness around them shuddered. Elijah's breath hitched, his pupils dilated. Something clicked, like a key turning in a lock. He remembered, not just Jordan, everything. The night Jordan disappeared, the whispers in the walls, the thing that came to their house wearing their mother's voice, the thing that took Jordan, the thing that had been pretending to be him ever since. Elijah yanked his hand away. "No." The figure before them screamed, a horrific, unnatural sound, like 1,000 voices crying out at once. Jordan's face melted away. The black mist swirled violently, twisting into an unnatural form. And then, it collapsed. The world shattered. And suddenly, Ben and Elijah were back, the light of the real world. The two of them gasped for air, collapsing onto the hard pavement. The sound of the truck's horn blared behind them as the 18-wheeler roared past, missing them by inches. Ben's head snapped up. They were back on the highway. The motel was gone. The black mist, gone. Everything was normal. Except Elijah. Ben turned. The boy stared at the ground, silent. Elijah. Slowly, Elijah lifted his head. Tears streamed down his face, but his eyes were clear. His lips trembled. "He's gone," Elijah whispered. "Really gone." Ben swallowed hard. The weight of reality settled over them. Elijah had made the choice. He had let go. And for the first time in years, the whispers were silent. Epilogue. A new dawn. Days passed, then weeks. Elijah went into protective custody, placed with a safe foster family. Ben checked on him often. They never spoke about that night. But one day, months later, Elijah handed Ben a note. It had only 2 words. "Thank you." Ben smiled. He said nothing, because he understood. And somewhere in the depths of the universe, the dead finally rested.